The first carving was crooked. He did it the day after they buried her. An 8-year-old boy standing at the base of the cottonwood tree by the creek with his father's pocketknife in both hands and his mother's name in his head and no idea how to make the letters come out straight. The bark of the cottonwood was thick and rough, and the knife was meant for whittling, not for writing, and the E came out too tall, and the L leaned sideways, and the second L was barely there at all, and the N looked like a fence post that had been knocked over by the wind. Ellen. 6 letters carved into the bark about 2 feet off the ground, the height an 8-year-old boy could reach if he stood on his toes and pressed hard. His mother had died of scarlet fever on a Tuesday in April of 1872. She was 31 years old. She had been sick for 5 days, and on the 6th day she was gone. And the house on the Flint Hills homestead went from a place that smelled like bread and soap and the lavender she grew by the kitchen door to a place that smelled like nothing at all. His father dug the grave on the hill behind the house, under the limestone outcrop where the wind was gentle and the prairie grass grew soft, and the neighbors came from the farms around Council Grove and stood in the grass and said the things people say when a young woman dies on the frontier, which are the same things people say everywhere, which is to say that there are no words, and the words they use are just sounds meant to fill the silence until the silence can be born. Eli did not speak at the funeral, and he stood beside his father and held his hat and watched the dirt go in. And when it was over, he walked to the creek and found the cottonwood tree, the biggest tree on the property, the one his mother used to sit under in the summers with her mending basket while he played in the water. And he took his father's knife from the barn and carved her name into the bark. He did it because he wanted her name to be somewhere that wasn't a grave. He wanted it to be somewhere alive. The tree was alive. The bark was alive. And if her name was in the bark, then some part of her was in the tree, and the tree would keep growing and her name would rise with it, and the letters would stretch and widen, the way trees stretch and widen everything they carry, and she would not be only in the ground. He went back the next year, April, the anniversary. He was 9, and the knife was still too big for his hands, but the letters came out better this time, straighter, more even, carved just above the first set. Ellen. He stood back and looked at the 2 names, one crooked and one almost straight, and he touched the bark, and the bark was warm from the sun, and the warmth felt like something he needed. He went back every year, every April. The carvings climbed the trunk the way a child climbs a wall, one set of letters at a time, each year a little higher, each year a little more sure. By the time he was 12, the letters were clean and deep, cut with the confidence of a boy who had taught himself to use a knife the way some boys teach themselves to use a rope or a saw, through repetition and the refusal to stop. Ellen. The same name, the same 6 letters, carved into the cottonwood once a year on the day she died. His father left when Eli was 11. Eli Parrish had been coming apart since Ellen died, the way a fence comes apart when you stop maintaining it. Not all at once, but one post at a time, one rail at a time, until one morning you look out and the thing that was holding the boundary together is lying in the grass and the boundary is gone. The whiskey came first, then the silence, then the mornings when Orrin didn't get out of bed, and Eli fed the animals and made his own breakfast and walked to school alone. And then, one October morning, the horse was gone and the saddle was gone, and Orrin's coat was gone from the peg, and there was a note on the table that said, "I'll be back," in handwriting that looked like it didn't believe itself. Eli waited a year for him to come back. Then he stopped waiting and started working. He was 11 years old, and the homestead was his, and the land didn't care how old you were. It cared whether the fence was up, and the well was clean, and the hay was cut before the frost. He learned to do everything a man does on a Kansas homestead, because the homestead required it, and there was no one else to require it of. The neighbors helped when they could. Old Mrs. Groves, 2 miles east, brought preserves in the winter and checked on him after storms. A quiet woman who never said much and never stayed long, but who always looked at Eli with an expression he didn't understand, a look that seemed to carry something heavier than neighborly concern. He kept carving. Every April, the carvings rose up the trunk past the height he could reach standing. So he brought a stool from the kitchen and stood on it and carved the name higher. By the time he was 15, the carvings had reached 6 feet off the ground, and the lower ones had begun to change the way carvings in living wood always change. The bark growing over the edges, the letters widening and softening. The oldest carving at the bottom, now just a suggestion of letters. The ghost of a crooked Ellen carved by a boy who no longer existed except in the tree's memory. He grew into a man the way trees grow into their shape. Slowly, without announcing it, 1 ring at a time. By 20, he was running 160 acres alone and selling beef to the buyers in Council Grove and keeping the stone house in the kind of repair that would have made his mother proud and his father ashamed. By 25, he was known in the county as a man who kept to himself and kept his word and kept his fences straight and his animals fed, and who rode out to the cottonwood by the creek every April and did something with a knife that nobody asked about, because the people of the Flint Hills understood that some rituals are private, and privacy is the one luxury the prairie gives for free. The 19th carving, April of 1891. He was 27 years old, and the carvings now spiraled up the trunk in a column that reached nearly 8 feet, the oldest ones at the bottom half, swallowed by the bark, and the newest ones at the top, still sharp and fresh. 19 times her name cut into the wood like a calendar written by a son who measured the years not by dates, but by the distance between the ground and the highest letters. He stood on the stool and carved the name and climbed down and looked at the trunk and counted them the way he always counted them, starting from the bottom, touching each one with his fingers, saying the number silently, the way a man says a prayer, not because anyone is listening, but because the saying is the point. 19. 19 years since she died. 19 times he had stood at this tree and cut her name into the bark and walked home and made supper and gone to bed and gotten up the next morning and done the work, because the work was the only thing that didn't leave. The 20th year, April of 1892. He rode to the tree the way he always did in the early morning before the sun was fully up, with the pocket knife in his vest pocket, the same knife, his father's knife. So the blade honed thin from 20 years of use and the handle worn smooth from 20 years of gripping. The Flint Hills were green with new grass, and the creek was running high from the spring rains, and the cottonwood was in early leaf, the branches covered in the pale green fuzz that comes before the full leaves unfold. He tied the horse to the fence post by the creek the way he always did, and he took the knife from his vest and walked toward the tree with the stool under his arm, and he saw it from 20 yards away. Something on the trunk that hadn't been there in April of last year. Something at the top of the column, just above his 19th carving, in the exact spot where the 20th should go. He stopped walking. He set the stool down in the grass and stood there and felt something move through his chest that was not grief and not anger, but something he did not have a name for. The particular vertigo of finding that a private thing is not as private as you believed. He walked closer. He put his hand on the bark and looked up. Ellen. Someone had carved it. The letters were fresh, cut within the last few days. The wood inside the cuts still white and raw and weeping sap. The carving was neat and careful, made by a hand that knew how to use a knife. And the letters were slightly different from his. The E was rounder, the L's were taller, the N had a particular lean to it that he did not recognize. Someone had come to this tree before him and carved his mother's name in the exact place he would have carved it, continuing the column, as continuing the count, as if they knew exactly what the ritual was and exactly where the next name should go. He stood at the tree for a long time. He touched the carving. He looked at the ground around the base of the trunk for boot prints or horse tracks or any sign of who had been there, but the grass was thick and the spring rain had washed the soil smooth and the creek bank held no impressions. He looked at the carving again. The handwriting, if you could call carving handwriting, was not his father's. Eli Parrish had been a rough man with rough hands, and his letters, the few Eli had seen, were jagged and impatient. These letters were careful, patient, made by someone who had taken their time and cared about how the name looked on the wood. He rode home slowly, letting the horse walk. Watched the Flint Hills moving past him in their long green waves, the way they had moved past him every April of his life. He sat on the porch and drank coffee that went cold while he held it, and thought about it the way a man thinks about something that has disrupted the only pattern in his life that he considered sacred. Someone knew about the tree. Someone had been watching, or someone had found the carvings, or someone had a connection to his mother that he didn't know about. The possibilities turned in his head like stones in a creek. He went to see Nettie Groves the next morning. He didn't know why exactly. She was the nearest neighbor, and she had known his mother, and she was the kind of woman who noticed things without appearing to notice them, the kind who might know something she had never had a reason to say. She was in her garden when he rode up, turning soil with a fork, her shawl over her shoulders and her hair tied back. She looked up at him the way she always looked at him, with that expression he had never quite understood, the one that carried more than what was on the surface. "Mrs. Groves," he said, "someone carved my mother's name into the cottonwood tree." She set the garden fork down. She didn't ask what tree. She didn't ask what name. She stood with her hands at her sides and looked at Eli with an expression that was slowly rearranging itself, the way a sky rearranges itself before weather comes, not suddenly, but with the particular patience of something that has been building for a long time. "I know," she said. "You know who did it?" Nettie looked at her garden, and then at the hills, and then at Eli. "I did." The silence between them lasted long enough for the wind to cross the yard and rattle the gate. Eli looked at this woman he had known his entire life, this quiet neighbor who brought preserves and checked on him after storms and had never once spoken about his mother in any way that went beyond the ordinary politeness of frontier neighbors. "Why?" he asked. Nettie sat down on the garden bench. She folded her hands in her lap and spoke with the careful deliberateness of someone who has been rehearsing a conversation for 20 years and has never been sure the right moment would come. "Your mother was my closest friend," she said, "before you were born, before your father even came to Kansas. Ellen and I were girls together in Independence. We grew up on the same street. We went to the same school. We were 16 when she married Orrin, and he brought her out here to the Flint Hills, and I married Walter Groves 2 years later, and we settled 2 miles east because I could not imagine living in a place where Ellen wasn't nearby." Eli sat down on his horse and listened. He had not known this. In 20 years of living 2 miles from Nettie Groves, in 20 years of accepting her preserves and her quiet concern, he had not known that she and his mother had been girls together in Independence. He had not known because no one had told him, and he had not asked. And the frontier is a place where people carry their histories inside them like stones in a river, worn smooth and invisible below the surface. When she died, Nettie continued, I wanted to do something, but you were already doing the thing. I saw you go to the tree that first year, the day after the funeral. I saw you from the ridge, a little boy with a knife too big for his hands, carving letters into the bark. And I watched you do it every year after that, every April. I never said anything because it was yours, your ritual, your grief. I had no right to it. She paused. The wind moved the grass in the garden, and the shawl on her shoulders and the loose hair at her temples. This year, I went to the tree in March. I don't know why. Maybe because 20 felt like a number that mattered. Maybe because I'm 50 years old and my hands are getting stiff and I wanted to carve her name at least once while I still could. Maybe because I have carried her inside me for 20 years the same way you have. And I needed the tree to know that. I needed the bark to hold her name from someone besides her son. I needed to tell her that she wasn't only remembered by the people she made, she was remembered by the people she chose. And she chose me, Eli. When we were girls, she chose me as her friend, and I have been carrying that choice every day since she left. Eli dismounted. He stood in Nettie Groves' garden with his hat in his hands and the sun on the back of his neck, and 20 years of not knowing pressing against the inside of his ribs like air that has been held too long. You've been watching me go to that tree for 20 years, he said. Every April, from the ridge. I never followed you down. I never went to look at the carvings until this March. And when I saw them, all 19 of them, going up the trunk like a ladder, I sat on the bank and I cried the way I should have cried at her funeral and didn't because I thought I had to be strong for your father and for you and for the idea that frontier women don't fall apart. She stood up from the bench and looked at him with the eyes of a woman who has been carrying a friendship for 20 years, past the point where it should have ended, keeping it alive in the private space behind her ribs, the way Eli kept it alive in the bark of a cottonwood tree. I should have told you sooner, she said. I should have told you who she was to me. I should have told you stories about her, what she was like at 16, how she laughed, the way she used to braid wildflowers into her hair in the spring. The things a son should know about his mother that have nothing to do with how she died. Tell me now, Eli said, and she did. They sat on the bench in the garden, and Nettie Groves told Eli Parrish about his mother for the first time in 20 years. She told him about independence and the school and the summer they both learned to swim in the Blue River. She told him about the way Ellen sang when she thought no one was listening, and the way she read books by candlelight, and the way she had of making anyone who talked to her feel like the only person in the room. She told him about the letters they wrote to each other for the 2 years between Ellen's marriage and Nettie's. Letters that crossed the prairie on the mail route and arrived smelling like dust and distance and the particular kind of love that women carry for each other when the frontier has taken everything else. She talked until the sun was high and the shadows were short and the garden was warm and the Kansas wind had settled into the gentle, steady push that comes in the middle of spring days when the land has decided to be kind. When she was finished, Eli stood up and put on his hat and looked at this woman who had been 2 miles east his whole life and who had been his mother's best friend and who had carved her name into a tree because 20 years of silence had finally become louder than the grief. "Next April," he said, "come with me to the tree." Nettie looked at him. Her eyes were red, and her hands were still in her lap, and the expression on her face was the one he had never understood until now. Not worry, not pity, not neighborly concern. It was love. The love of a woman looking at the child of the person she had loved most in the world, seeing the mother's face in the son's face, carrying the weight of it silently for 2 decades because she didn't know how to set it down. "I'd like that," she said. And the way she said it, quietly, with the particular steadiness of a woman who has been waiting to be asked, told him that she had been hoping for this invitation for longer than he could guess. Maybe since the first carving, maybe since the funeral, maybe since the day Ellen died and Nettie lost the only person on the frontier who knew who she had been before the frontier made her into who she was. He rode home. He went to the cottonwood tree and stood at the base and looked up at the 20 carvings in the bark, 19 in his hand and 1 in hers. And for the first time in 20 years, the tree felt like something shared instead of something solitary. His mother's name rising up the trunk in the handwriting of her son and her closest friend, 2 people who had loved her in different ways and carried her in different silences, and who had finally found each other at the base of the same tree. The 21st carving, the following April, they did together. Eli carved the letters, and Nettie stood beside him and held the stool, and when he was finished, she touched the bark the way you touch a headstone or a door frame or the face of someone sleeping, gently, with the full weight of everything you cannot say pressed into the tips of your fingers. The cottonwood kept growing, the carvings kept rising, and the name kept climbing toward the branches where the leaves came in every spring, green and trembling, reaching for the sky the way all living things reach for the light, carrying the dead with them, not as a burden, but as a root.